a strong feeling of strangeness, and I only came back because of you, writes Lea Grundig in a letter from Prague on December 19, 1948 to her husband Hans Grundig. She had survived the Shoah in Palestine. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Jewish Identity and Communist Belief, Lea Grundig's path from Dresden to Palestine and back to Dresden. This is an event of our new monthly series, Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression, which is generously sponsored by Allianz Partners. I'm Rachel Stern, founding director and CEO of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. I'm excited to introduce Eckhart Gillen, who has worked extensively about the artist Lea Grundig and is known for his expertise of the historical and artistic context Grundig lived and worked in. Please submit your questions to the Q&A section. Eckhart Gillen is an independent curator based in Berlin who has organized numerous exhibitions and published widely on Russian, American, and German art of the 20th century. Among his exhibition catalogs and books are Amerika, Traum und Depression, 1920-40, Akademie der Künste, Berlin, 1980, German art from Beckmann to Richter, Images of a Divided Country, Yale University Press, 1997. In collaboration with Stephanie Barron, he curated Art of Two Germanys, Cold War Cultures, 1945 to 1989, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Germanisches Nationalmuseum Nürnberg, Deutsches Historisches Museum Berlin, 2009. Feindliche Brüder, der Kalte Krieg und die deutsche Kunst, 1945 to 1989, Berlin 2009. R.B. Kitoy, The Retrospective, Jewish Museum Berlin, Jewish Museum London und Hamburger Kunsthalle 2012. Art in Europe, 1945 to 1968, Facing the Future. Rosar, Brussels, ZKM Karlsruhe, Pushkin Museum Moscow 2016-17. Flashes of the Future, The Art of the 68ers, Ludwig Forum Aachen 2018, Constructing the World, Art and Economy 1919 to 1939 in the USA, Soviet Union and Germany at Kunsthalle Mannheim 2018-19. Since 2011, Eckhart is adjunct professor for art history at the Film University in Potsdam-Babelsberg. Welcome, Eckhart.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for inviting me. I start with a communist. And you see the title, and I start with a communist. Lea Grundig was a daughter of the Jewish clothing and furniture retailer Moritz Langer. I show you the portrait she did. And she leaves her family's Orthodox milieu at the young age of 18 to study at the Dresden Art Academy. There she meets art student Hans Grundig in 1925, dissociating herself from the exploitative capitalist class of her family and of this bourgeois milieu, which she described as petty bourgeois narrowness of her life. And she met him, and you can see them here as a young couple in the forest of Dresden. Or you see a wonderful drawing example of an emancipated erotic life in the late 20s by Lea. And you see two portraits of Hans Grundig, of her husband. He was a painter of the new objectivity. On the left, you see his portrait of my wife, of Lea. And on the right, you see him as in a self-portrait 1 year later. He was 5 years older than Lea and the son of a poor painter and decorator, and he became immediately the fixed point of her future life. She started to read Karl Marx and joined the German Communist Party together with him in 1926. A quote by her, "Now I saw an answer as bright and clear as a light that was never to be extinguished. Now I knew that the order of capital and labor represented disorder and crime." You see here early work by her. This is a discussion on the street between workers the Communist Party and the Social Democrats, which are really fighting, and they were called, the Social Democrats were called a kind of fascists, social fascists. Anyway, she said, what I thought, what moved me politically, that was what I wanted to draw and paint. I didn't want to be a communist here and an artist there. She remained true to this principle throughout her life, throughout all the uncertainties of her life, up until her death. And she lived with her husband beside her rich parents in a very, very poor one-room apartment at Ostbahnstraße. And you see some of her portraits she did in the neighborhood there, in the other tenements. There's two girls here and two girls with a puppet. You see here brother and sister, and the street with playing kids. You see the famous Prague Street, which disappeared completely after the Second World War. So after the death of his father, Hans Grundig left the academy, and they married against the will of Lea's father. The Communist Party became Lea's new political home. The content of her life was now political art and work in a communist artist group called ASO, which emerged in 1930. She said, we wanted our life to be quite clear, unambiguous, and one. That's how we lived, and that is why we were happy. You see here a demonstration of the Communist Party in Dresden. You see a working woman she did in 1930, a pregnant wife. And you see, that was really her strength, that even as a teenager, she started and developed a special talent for capturing characteristic details of physiognomy. And she drew neighbors, and she drew also the violent fantasies of children, like this little boy with his war toys in the back, and also old people subject to mockery. Here, The Witch in 1935, engraven, in which a bent old woman is being pursued by a horde of children. What she can show is how the invisible is shaped by his or her social environment. The proletarian revolutionary art is disclosing the degrading living conditions under capitalism, is replaced at the beginning of the Nazi dictatorship by a new art of anti-fascist graphic, which you can see here. It's a cycle under the swastika, and you see here, for example, whispering in the streets. You see the Gestapo, the secret police in the house, or you see interned. You see how the among the people, the against each other, the power against each other. You see here German mothers who have babies with Stahlhelm already in her lap, and cannon fodder, for example. Then this is a German soldier. It's all from cycles like anti-fascist primer or under the swastika. And then here you see the Liberated in 41. And this is clearly inspired by Goya, which you can see here, feet with dead people, or the footsteps. And you see here cannons instead of butter, which is clearly inspired, obviously inspired by Hartfield's photo montage, Hooray, the butter is all. So we can see her in the late 1940s already in Dresden. And I'm coming back to the time in Palestine, but I take first now the time in the GDR. She comes back in the newly founded GDR, and there we can see her here in the late 40s. And what she's doing, bringing all her talents in portraying people to the Communist Party, and especially here in this, yeah, in this kind of political art of showing the worker. But her loyalty was very much tested by the formalism campaign. And she said, now we are formalists, we are degenerate artists. And when that is actually what we did as communist artists, then there must be specific times when beautiful is a lie. The beautiful, what the Communist Party was wanting is for her a lie. And she said, all my colleagues from the ASO, from the Communist Artist Group, now they have had the roots that grounded us cut off. They have demanded from us that we declare our entire work to date dead and buried and start again from the scratch. So you see, this is a situation in she was beginning, and she made this cork master here very early, long before the Bitterfeld path was starting in 51. Or she did here the Master Gensch and the coal washing also in 51. And three from the brigade in 61, women in the qualification, that was in Schwedt, in the petrochemical trust. And she held also many political functions, also in the Central Committee. And then she was president of the Artists Union of East Germany, which was really the highest rank she could get. But she was not really with her comrades, with her artist colleagues. She was always close, in close relationship to the party. And that made her a real hate figure in East Germany among the artists. Now we come to the Jew. By contrast to the latently anti-Semitic and officially anti-Zionist politics of the Soviet Union, and especially of Poland and the GDR, Lea Grundig actively backed the official policies, and but at the same time, she was also a confessed Jew. And you see very early, already in 1934, she did drawings like "The Jew is Our Misfortune" or "The Jewish Burial," or she did a lot of work. And this, for example, as her friend, her comrade was reporting to me, this was done 3 years before her death. She remembered the time before, in the end, or before she left Germany. All that came back in the end of her life. And you see the liberation of the women in Ravensbrick. That was a concentration camp in the north of Berlin for women, especially for women. And she was telling her comrade, her girlfriend, Maria Heine, how she was in protective custody, and how she came to the Ravensbrick cassette, and she could escape from there in the last minute after a total of 20 months of imprisonment. And she had the chance to flee to Palestine. I can't tell you now the whole adventurous story, how she went down the Danube and via the Black Sea, which in an old boat from Greek ship owners, and through the Dardanelles, which is normally a trip of 4 days, but that took for her 6 weeks. And she came to Palestine and was refused to land. And the Haganah then made an explosion, and though the British authorities were forced to bring the people and land. And she was interned in a internment camp, Atlit, near Haifa. And on this way, on the boat and in this camp, she had wonderful models because they were patient. They had nothing to do, And so she could do all these wonderful drawings, which are now in the Academy of Arts in Berlin. The tailor from Poland, for example, that was done on the boat, or the mother with child. She draws the beauty of women and the strain of passion and suffering inscribed into their faces. And you can see here an Arab woman. You see it's a nice thanks, giving thanks to a doctor in the camp, Dr. Saxel, in the baby barrack, for example. Or you see her here in the Syncography, a workshop. Lea is shown here as a cat on the left side, upper side, also a watercolor. But the main work she did in that time, that was between 1943 and 44, The Valley of Slaughter, comprising 70 ink drawings. And this was her main work there in Palestine. And you can interpret, like Siva Amisha Meisel, that her work now for the first time was not party-oriented, not political anti-fascist art, but it was for the first time in the context of Jewish art. And this cycle was called the Casa of Valley of Death, in a tradition of accusatory Jewish art. And it refers to Jakob Steinhardt. You can see the drawing on the right side, Pogrom, showing a man, a bearded man, like a prophet, amidst the murdered inhabitants of a shtetl. And that was, it was referring to the big pogrom in Kishinev. Kishinev, which is now the capital of the Republic of Moldavia. That was a very famous pogrom in 1903. And you see, she is inspired by this Steinhardt's image he did. And this image also reference to a poem. And this poem, it's too long to explain all that, but the title comes from this poem. And we see Steinhardt, who also emigrated from Berlin to Jerusalem in 1933. So it would be possible that she met him in Jerusalem. Anyway, this is a very, very important cycle she did. It was published in Palestine, in a kibbutz, and it was also published in German in the Soviet occupation zone before the foundation of the GDR in 1947. I'll show you some examples, like towards Lublin in the Valley of Slaughter, that's near Majdanek. The gasification is also part of that. And Kurt Liebmann did the German version of that. And in the German version, he, for the last time before the GDR was founded, he was really writing sentences which you never read in the communist countries later. Cursed be those who close their eyes and refuse to see. Cursed be those who close their ears and refuse to hear. It is not an isolated cry, a call to humanity from the disastered year of 1943. Woe indeed to a people who will not accept the horrors of their history and therefore cannot forget. If they are not aware of their guilt, if they feel no shame over the crimes that they have tolerated. That were strong sentences which never were used again, as we will see now. She did other cycles which never were printed in Germany, like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Ghetto Revolt. You see the situation in the ghetto, it's in 1946. And you see here on the left side how bread is exchanged against a wristwatch, you know, through a hole or in the wall of this ghetto. It's here on the left side. yeah, you see early work from the swastika in 33, sleeping prisoners, and on the other side, Requiem from 1948. And there in the background, you see a child in Naples, like the depiction of the birth of Jesus Christ, the hope for the future. He lies among the ruins. Then we have here the ghetto fighter, the ruins of Warsaw, the path into the gas, 45, all cycles like Never Again, which were not printed in East Germany. Here is a self-portrait of her, and you see her very much concerned now, before she came back to Dresden, how the public will receive this work, this accusatory work with many Jewish themes. She was not unsure how the Germans will react to their guilt. And it took a long, long time, which I also can't explain now, how she came back from via Prague to Dresden. It took about 4 years until 49. And it was also very difficult because, it was, it has to be it has to be handled with care and secretly, because the Jewish society in Palestine treated emigration as treaty. Lea wrote to Hans, to her husband, don't mention emigration to Germany. Everybody is a criminal who even talks about such things. Finally, they managed to come back to Dresden. That's how she looked in 45. It's a photograph. And then the first thing she did as she was in Prague, before she went back to Dresden, she already in Israel tried to get a visa to Poland and first to Czechoslovakia. In Prague, the first thing she did, she went to Theresienstadt. And you see here, Terezin Street without coming back. This was a road taken by those condemned to death. Prisoners had been compelled to construct this road using the ashes of their fellow prisoners who had been incinerated. And then after that, she came from Prague, where she visited Terezin, to Dresden. And from Dresden, the first thing she did, and this was already organized in Israel, that she went to Auschwitz, to Poland. That was very important for her. And she did this watercolor first in Majdanek, in the gas, and then she was in Auschwitz. She did the children of Auschwitz in 1950, as she came back then to Dresden. She wrote, as I came back to Auschwitz, I saw feet running, standing. I heard and saw the hundred thousands of people, their suffering, their cries, their tears. The streets of Poland, is that called also Cycle Never Again. And the earth of Auschwitz, a watercolor. She shows the traces of the barefooted. This is everything they leave and their only sign of existence. Perhaps when you see all these works and you compare them with the early graphics from Dresden in the early 30s and late 20s, perhaps it was a tragedy for the artist Lea Grundig that her talent of portraying people had to stay back since the late 1930s for the depiction of the Shoah. Instead of drawing after life, which was her strength and talent, she had to imagine the Holocaust from some photographs and reports. Forced to express her outrage and hatred in symbolic forms, metaphors and visions, she was now more inventing than watching her models. The Shoah was far away. Now, as she came back to Dresden, she of course tried to print and to find a publisher for all these cycles I have shown you now, like Never Again. Finally, the minister president, Otto Grotewohl, to whom she subsequently turned to for support for the printing of her work, which was the most important thing for her, He wrote her in September 1950, quote, "Esteemed comrade Lea Grundig, it was with a sense of great shock that I set aside the portfolio never again. The social changes that are taking effect already, the people's increasing efforts to protect themselves against wars through peace, the development of the economy and a new collective awareness, so making their lives worth living, all these are far more powerful today than feelings of revolt, disgust, and hate. Today, art's expressive means must adapt to the situation, which was changed spiritually as well. This must be documented in connection with the publication of fine art prints." So he said no. Look to the future. That was a motto around 48, in line with the national anthem by Johannes Becher. And it was called Anti-Fascism Without Jews. It came even worse. In January 1951, a pamphlet against formalism appeared under the name of Orlov, and it was called Paths and Errors of the Modern Art. And it maintained, but an art that models itself and degeneration and decay as pathological and anti-aesthetic. Degeneration and decay are characteristic of a society heading for the grave. So they used the same term which the Nazis used in 1937 in this campaign against degenerate art. That was horror for her. And for example, this article was illustrated by this terror called graphic in the cycle of Never Again, which she wanted to print in East Germany. Devout communist, the accusation of being a degenerate artist in Nazi terminology, and the ban on images reminding people of the genocide against the Jews must have represented a crucial test of loyalty for Lea Grundig. In your study of the history of the Jewish communists, Karen Hardwick called that anti-fascism without Jews, as I said already. But very strange is the fact that this painting of her husband, Hans Grundig, in 1947, the victims of fascism, that she personally, used that painting and made an interpretation in her autobiography. That is really very strange because she was saying that she was taking up the difference between the victims who were not fighting against fascism and the victorious Communist Party members. So you can see that here, contrary to her husband's intention, Lea Grundig differentiates between the fighter, this is the man in the background who's lying there, and the man in the foreground. But the man in the foreground, he became, in this version of Dresden, the red triangle and the yellow one to the Star of David. So precisely Hans Grundig identifies with a defenseless figure by using his own number, which you can see in the foreground on the thigh of this man, his personal number, which he wore in the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen, which you can see in the background. But she said, against the will of and the attention of her husband, released at last, the fighter lies still. You see his head in profile. It is austere, characterized by infinite suffering. He wears a red scarf wound around his head like the laurels of victory. At the same time, it has been blooded by martyrs. Or is it a red black? He cannot be defeated. Two dead, but two quite different men. One lies on his back, facing upwards. That's the man behind. The other is bowed down, still in death, compelled to hide away. He is ashamed. His face is turned towards the ground. He is still attempted to conceal his face behind his stiffened hand. While the fighter was supposedly chosen by Hans Grundig to embody the ethic of the struggle for human dignity or defending oneself against inhuman baseness, the commitment to a great cause to the liberation of all people to communism. The defenseless figure lies still bent, defiled, and abused in death. He wishes to go on hiding his dead face, always fleeing, pursued to the last. He died without a struggle, defenseless, rejecting the right of all living things, the right to fight for survival. This is very strange. Did Lea Grundig, because of her own experiences in prisons and internment camps, constantly fleeing and narrowly escaping death on an exploding ship before the coast of Haifa, probably saw herself as a defenseless victim throughout her life? Did she perhaps saw her husband as a heroic counterpart, a fighting hero of the resistance? We don't know. But her stance was always ambivalent when her communist face on loyalty to the party was on stake. An example for that is the so-called 6 Days War in June 1967. And the Communist Party published a declaration of Jewish citizens in June 1967 in the paper Neues Deutschland, which was written by Jewish members of the party. And it's very interesting. There are many Jews there in the Politburo, like Albert Norden. His parents were killed in the KZ Theresienstadt. Hermann Axen was son of a rabbi of Breslau. Rudolf Herrnstadt, chief editor of the Neue Deutschland, Gerhard Eisler, Kurt Hagel, they're all Jews. And they wrote, after all the terrible lessons of the past, the political leaders of Israel are cooperating not only with the imperialists, but also with the murderers of the Jewish people, the West German imperialists in Bonn. But on the other side, the many Jewish citizens in GDR didn't sign the declaration. For example, Arnold Zweig, who was also in Palestine, and Lea Grundig met him there. 11 Jewish GDR citizens signed it, and among them was Lea Grundig. And logically, she made a drawing of Jordanian refugees' children. In spite of this, Lea Grundig stayed in contact with her friends in Palestine and Israel from the time of her exile. For example, I give you just one example, the writer Avi Shaul, an Israeli writer. She met in 1941, and now she invited him to Dresden. And I found in the archive her letter to the Foreign Office of the GDR, and she was guaranteeing that she will host him and be responsible for him. So she invited him for a fortnight. And she met a lot of other people and friends from that time. So they kept contact at that time. On the other side, she also continued to work on topics of the Shoah. For example, this memorial in Meißen by the sculptor Georg Türke, that was done after a drawing by her, roll call in the concentration camp. Or she made this drawing, Deportation of the Jews, for a children's book, or this illustration for Hedda Zinner's story. And another illustration here, 1,200,000 children were gassed in 1966. You will see her here in 1966, a portrait she did before his death in 1957 of Hans Grundig, and a double portrait from 64. And he was already dead, you see that, because his eyes are closed. To be taken ill by cancer, Lea Grundig became acquainted with a young doctor, Maria Heine, which I already mentioned. And Maria Heine reported about the last journey, 1977, to Egypt and back along the coast of Israel to the Black Sea. On board of the ship, Lea Grundig suffered a heart attack and died on October 10th near the Romanian port of Constanța. Exactly at that port, there she had started her adventurous exile 37 years before, in 1940. Once again, she came back near to her country of exile. She was passing Israel from Egypt to the Black Sea, where she lived in internment camps. But her life became in Palestine, and that she might have remembered. This time was a turn into the open world, without a part in a state controlling her mind. It was her chance to find new ideas in the diaspora, where people from all over the world came together and mixed. Here she did wonderful drawings of the beautiful landscapes of Palestine, for example, the Jerusalem Old City Hall, or here Haifa, the coast of Haifa, which are all now in Berlin and the Academy. And the last drawing she did on the ship going back is Mediterranean coast, the last drawing in 1977. Thank you very much for listening and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eckhart. There's so many questions. Please, everyone, send us in your questions. And I already have a question asking about the reasons, whether there were reasons given for her not denied landing in Palestine. Why was she not able to enter Palestine?
Well, that was the law of the British authorities in Palestine. It was a British Mandat territory. And that's why the Haganah was doing these terrorist acts and making an explosion to force British authorities to let the people land. That was the reason.
Yeah, and she was actually interned.
Then she was interned, of course, as any refugees were interned in Atlit, the very famous big internment camp, which still is a memorial today. You can visit it. And there she was staying for a year before she could leave the internment camp. And first she lived with her sister and then with her father, first in Haifa and then in Jerusalem, or in Tel Aviv. Yeah, Tel Aviv.
Right. So basically her most of her family was able to escape.
Yeah.
Escape the death.
And her sister. Yeah.
That's amazing. So Lynette Roth says, thank you very much for this deep dive into the work of Lea Grundig, Eckhart. It was striking that you said she returned to the topic of the Shoah in work before her death, as in the example of liberation of the women in Ravensbrick. Was her earlier accusatory work been discussed in Germany by that time? What was the context of the children's book illustration in the 60s?
Yeah, the context, the children's books, that was done in Palestine, not in, but she delivered some illustrations for school books in GDR, which I have shown. But the problem was that her real work, her main work, was not discussed in GDR. And I quoted the letter of Grotewol, of the minister president, explaining her, we don't need that work anymore. We don't want to look back. We want to look forward to the future, building up the socialism, building paradise or utopia. And we don't want to be, in any case, we don't want to be remembered to the past, because the past, we overcame that and it's not of any interest anymore. That's what many people told her. And that's why she, at the final authority, she wrote a letter to the minister president And so he answered her that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so how were Jews treated in East Germany? I think, you know, we have to really remember. I grew up with that wall separating Western and Eastern Germany that could not permeate it, at least not from the east, and only under very strong restrictions you could visit from the west. So how was the how did it happen that Jews ended up there, and how were they treated in the GDR?
They were hiding. They were really hiding. As I mentioned, all these members of the Politburo, of the Central Committee, there were many, many Jews, but they never would say we are Jews. They were just hiding, and very few Jews were bold enough, like Arnold Zweig or Heinz Kamnitzer or Peter Edel, the head of the Union of Jewish Communities, Helmut Ares, who wrote this, who were refusing to sign this letter of the Communist Party against Israel. We know from some painters, from some writers, we know also from Jewish cemeteries, which were just destroyed. There were streets built over them. And there's one artist who was documenting all that Jewish cemeteries which disappeared, which were not cared for. Only in the late years of the 80s, as Honecker wanted to be received in the United States for a state visit, they started to keep some of the Jewish community estates like this. There was a Jewish community which disappeared, but they cared for the cemetery and made documentation and so on with students from the Protestant theology in the Humboldt University. But that was only in the late years. Before, we didn't care about at all. That came from Soviet Union, of course. Remember the last terror trials against the Jewish doctors by Stalin in the early 50s before he died. And there were, of course, Jewish leaders and functionaries in the communist parties, but they didn't really claim to be Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so was how was if you said that the history wasn't discussed at all in the GDR, like
Yeah.
does that mean only the Shoah, or also like how did they connect at all to the history, or how was that situation in the GDR?
They didn't discuss the genocide of the Jews. They didn't. All the memorials were for the communist fighters, for the resistance fighters. That was a Jew, like Buchenwald, the self-freeing of the Buchenwald, and swearing never again, and so on and so on. But there was also a Jewish barrack which was not really shown as that there were Jewish prisoners. That was not interesting. It was not. They didn't care for that. It was only like Lea Grundig's interpretation of the painting by Hans Grundig, who is one of the few artworks where you can see this yellow triangle, yeah, this for the Jews. In the first version he did for Leipzig, the museum in Leipzig, it's only the red triangle that was for the political prisoners. The yellow was for the Jews. And though he combined them to the Star of David, and that was the only one who did that. Of course, he was married with a Jew, with Lea, but she didn't understand that he was identifying himself with the Jewish prisoners of Sachsenhausen or of the concentration camps. She didn't understand that. She made a difference between the Jew who is defenseless, who was not fighting, and the other one who is this heroic person with this laurel on the head and this profile, and the other one is ashamed. Yeah. Mm. So she had that in a way. It was inside her. That was her ambiguity, a difference. She was believing in the Communist Party, and this was against her in a way because they were anti-Semitic. And on the other side, of course, she was very aware to be a Jew. And that was her conflict all that time in the GDR until her death. And that is a tragedy I wanted to show here in this lecture.
Yeah. And you did very impressively so. And Ted Comet asks, why did she leave Palestine and return to Germany?
That was like you in the beginning were quoting, that was because of her husband. He said she loved Palestine, and she realized the beginning of Israel in 48. She was witness of the founding of this new state, and that was a warm country. She met a lot of people. It was a free country. It was not a dictatorship, and so she had wonderful friends and possibilities to print her graphics also on the Shoah, and she said, it's very hard for me to leave the country and to come back, but I come because of you. That she wrote in the letter, I come because of you. And then, of course, I mean, you can imagine she came also to build up the communist part of Germany because she was a communist.
Yeah. So David Stern asked, would you say that Lea Grundig was a victim of her communist ideology?
In a way, yes, because it was a real fairy tale. It was a belief, it was a secular religion in a way. How she was doing it, yeah, she was not critical. She was in a way naive, and she believed in communism because she loved Hans Grundig, and he was a communist. And she was keeping to that, and she said, and it was, of course, the hatred against her father. He was against the marriage of Hans. He even offered Hans Grundig money to go to Paris and to become a Bohemian artist. And it was a hatred of her family background, of this Orthodox capitalist way of living. And she was young, of course, and she became also a member of a Jewish youth group, Weiß Blau. That was a kind of Wandervogel. She was very young. She was 18, and she, of course, she did everything to realize her dream and the change from that life to a new life. And she did that with all the consequences of a young man, of a young woman, of young people.
Yeah. And pretty radically so. And because I also read that Hans Grundig was, in the very beginning, he was willing to convert to Judaism, even to make this relationship within the family context possible. But apparently that didn't fit into her ideas.
He did it because of the father. The father was so strictly against this marriage that he offered that he would do that for the peace in the family.
Yeah, unbelievable. Ursula Frohne asks, thank you, Eckhart, for your excellent talk and the insight in Lea Grundig's powerful work. I'm stunned by the fact that you find hardly documentation of her images in art history surveys. Do you relate this virtual invisibility of her iconography to her declared communist attitude, or rather to the ongoing reluctance of dealing with the atrocities of the Shoah?
Sorry, I didn't get the question fully.
Okay, I'd read it again. I'm stunned by the fact that you find hardly documentation of her images in art history surveys. You relate this virtual invisibility of her iconography to her declared communist attitude, or rather to the ongoing reluctance of dealing with the atrocities of the Shoah?
Ah, yeah, okay, I got it. Yeah, I mean, that is both. In West Germany, nobody was interested in Lea Grundig because she was a communist. We had a Cold War. It was only the Ladengalerie, Frau Müller, who made a wonderful documentation here is a real Werkverzeichnis full, but it was very hard to get interest in her. And in the East, nobody wanted to see the atrocities, of course, yes. And so only part of her work was remembered. And even Erhard Fromhold, for example, from Dresden, he was a very progressive communist, a real communist. He published the first book on her, the first monography on her in 56 or 58. And he was not publishing one single print from her Shoah graphics, nothing, no. No, only the early communist things against the National Socialists, of course, from the 30s. And then, of course, the work she did for the Bitterfeld work, showing the young workers and women workers, which in a way, I forgot to mention that were not heroic. They were really skeptical people. She portrayed in her old ability to portray people. So both sides of Germany, East and West, were not fully taking up her work as an artist. She's still underestimated. She's still not really well known. There is no real monography on her, but at the moment there is some preparation by Kathleen Grenzlin. She's editing a full edition of her letters among Hans and Lea, letters to her husband and the husband to her. So this might give new insights in her life, in her biography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. Would you know where you could see her work in the UK? In which UK collections?
I don't know. I have no idea. No.
Okay.
The most works are in the Academy of Art in Berlin. There are all these drawings from Adlit, from the internment camp. And there are works, of course, in the Kupferstich Cabinet, in the state museums, and in Dresden. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so many good questions here. Henry Myrick Hughes asks, can you please tell us when socialist realism began to bite in the GDR around the time of Grotewohl's letter? And how did this affect Lea Grundig's attitude to fellow artists when she was president of the VBK?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because she was a victim of this socialist realism, of this formalism campaign against formalism in the early 50s. And in spite of this experience, well, she said, well, Fritz Kramer is the same generation as I, and we were not allowed really to follow up our art from the 1920s, the verism. In the same situation, she was stabbing Kramer in his back in 1964 on the fifth conference of the Artists Union, where Heisig and Kramer and others they were giving very, very bold speeches against this party who is trying to treat the artists like kids, you know. And she was against Kramer. She was saying, no, this is against the party and he's wrong and this is a shame and so on. So 10 years earlier, it happened to her, the party was attacking her and Kramer and all this generation. And 10 years later, she forgot that and kept the party line. Yeah. And that's also very tragic.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it was a kind of a resignation on her side? Because I think, I mean, there are many communists who consciously went into East Germany to help build this a perfect communist vision and state, and many of them were Jews and came from all over trying to build the perfect society. And so do you think she kind of gave up on that idea as she saw this was really not the direction, that this was not becoming the perfect society, but something else entirely?
Well, in the 60s, that was not clear. In the 60s, there was much hope that the GDR could really have success. And so in the 60s, I think she became a president of the Artists Union. It was the highest rank she could get as an artist. And she was in the central committee. And I think she was very proud. And she said, I'm compelled, I must follow the party line. And Alfred Corella was very charming and very intelligent functioneer. And he said, Lea, come on, you must be with us and you must follow the line. It's very strange how that works, yeah. But it worked. And yeah, she felt really, I must do that. Very strange. And you must say, all these people who came from the Western emigration, they were from the beginning, like Hartfield, for example, he came from London. They were suspected people. Only the people who came from Moscow, who went through the Stalinism, the terror trials of the 30s, they were the ruling people. They were the ruling people, and they were trusted by the Soviet Union and by the Soviet authorities. But all these other people from Mexico and from like Theobalden or many of these people were really suspected, and Hartfield had to apply again to become member of the Communist Party. He was member of the Communist Party. He had to apply again. And he had no chance to follow up his work. He made some design for the Deutsche Theater on very, not important, not political work. He was really like a rentier. He had a nice house, but in Bukow, but he was, when German sagt, kaltgestellt. He had no chance really in the public as an artist.
Right. So our time is up, but I want to ask you one more question by Lynette Roth. She asked, can you speak to Lea Grundig's stylistic variety? While portraiture links much of her work, her range from her early woodcuts to watercolor, like the one you showed of the zincography workshop, to her best known ink drawings, it is very striking.
Yeah, she started, she was Dix and Verism and New Objectivity. But then she said, well, Dix is himself decadent and bourgeois and so on. So she followed more the Kollwitz, Käthe Kollwitz. And she changed in the 30s, but she was always very clear, and she was a wonderful portrait artist and very exact and precise. But then, as I mentioned already, as she was in Palestine, far away from the Shoah, and she had to work, doing her work from her mind, from her vision, from her imagination. As you could see, the works became more surreal and not so precise anymore, symbolic and so. But then again, back to GDR, as she started to portray the workers, she came back to this very similar to this kind of exact portraying of the 20s. And I think her portraits are not heroic. They are very taking serious the model and looking carefully and taking it serious, the personality, the character she was portraying. And you could see that in the examples I gave you.
Yeah, they're very, very striking and touching. Thank you so much again, Eckhart, for your thought-provoking talk. We could continue for much longer. We will post the recording of this event and the event link on our website. Please stay in touch with us, stay well and stay strong. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very much.